The doctors said she was losing her mind. Her mother-in-law said she had always been unstable. Her own sister started keeping her distance. And her husband, the man she had cooked for, prayed for, built a life with, stood in front of every single person who loved her and said, with his eyes full of the exact right amount of worry, "She needs help. She's not well." But here is the question nobody thought to ask. What if she wasn't crazy at all? What if the only thing wrong with her was that she was getting too close to something her husband desperately needed her not to find? Because there is a particular kind of cruelty that never raises its voice. That never leaves a mark. That works quietly, in the background, turning the lights down so slowly that you don't realize the room has gone dark until you can no longer see your own hands in front of your face. And Amara was living inside that kind of cruelty every single day, she just didn't have a name for it yet. This is her story. Her name was Amara Osebonsu, and she had one of those laughs that could fill an entire room without even trying. Not performed. Not polished for company. Just genuinely hers, big and warm and completely unself-conscious, the kind of laugh that made strangers look up from their phones on the subway and smile without knowing why. People were drawn to her. Always had been. There was something grounding about the way she moved through a room, the way she looked at people like they were actually worth being looked at. She had grown up in Lagos, the second of 4 children, in a house that was loud in all the right ways. Her mother cooked jollof rice from scratch every Sunday, the kind that perfumed the entire neighborhood, and her father sang off-key to old Fela Kuti records in the sitting room while everyone pretended not to hear. It was the kind of home where love was not a word people said cautiously. It was something you felt in the way someone passed you food, or sat with you in the dark, or called just to say nothing in particular. Amara had carried all of that with her when she moved to Seoul at 26 for a postgraduate program in international business. She had arrived in spring, when the cherry blossoms were still on the trees and the air had that particular coolness that felt like a promise. She had a scholarship, a single suitcase, and the absolute certainty that she was going to build something that mattered. Seoul, she decided within the first week, was a city that rewarded the serious. She intended to be very serious. And she was. She graduated at the top of her program. Secured a position at an international trade consultancy before her visa had time to expire. Made a life for herself in a city that was not always easy for someone who looked like her, navigated the double takes and the assumptions and the occasional small cruelties with the same grace she navigated everything, which is to say, without losing her stride. She was 31 when she met Jun-seo. It was a rainy Thursday evening in October. She had ducked into a small bookshop near Hongik University to wait out a sudden downpour, the kind of rain that appears from nowhere in autumn's Seoul and soaks you to the skin before you've had time to find your umbrella. The shop was narrow and warm and smelled of old paper and whatever the owner was burning in a small brass incense holder near the counter. Amara had gone straight to the fiction section without thinking, the way she always did, running her fingers along the spines until one caught her attention. She pulled it out. A Korean literary novel she had been meaning to read for months, with a translation she had heard was extraordinary. She turned it over in her hands. And as she did, another hand appeared from the other side of the shelf, reaching for the same book. She pulled back. He pulled back. There was a pause, and then they both appeared around the edge of the shelf at the same time, and they looked at each other, and somehow, from that very first moment, it was the kind of eye contact that takes a second longer than it should. He insisted she take the book. She insisted he take it. He said he could order another copy online. She said she had been looking for it for weeks and he should take it. He said he would feel terrible walking out with the last copy. She said she would feel equally terrible. This went on for longer than was strictly sensible, and at some point they were both laughing, and the old man behind the counter was watching them with a look of patient amusement, and neither of them walked out with the book. They walked out together. Into a cafe next door. Where they stayed for 2 hours. Jun-seo Lim was the kind of man who was polished in a way that you couldn't quite put your finger on at first. It wasn't arrogance, exactly, more like the quiet confidence of someone who had never had to fight very hard to be taken seriously. He was lean and sharp-jawed, immaculately dressed even for a casual Thursday evening in a bookshop, with dark eyes that were more attentive than warm. He listened carefully when Amara spoke. He asked good questions. He had studied in London, spent 2 years working in Singapore, and had returned to Seoul 3 years ago to join his father's company, an import and logistics firm that had been in the Lim family for 2 generations. The Lim name, Amara would learn later, carried real weight in certain circles of Seoul's business world. Old money and carefully maintained reputation. The kind of family that did not make noise but did not need to, because their presence was felt through quieter, more durable channels. But that first evening she knew none of that. She just thought he was interesting. And interesting people had always been her particular weakness. They exchanged numbers at the end of the evening. He texted her that same night, a link to the book they had both refused to take, available at a shop in Insadong, with a message that said only, "Found it." She smiled at her phone for longer than she would ever admit. They dated for 2 years. 2 years of slow Sunday mornings in his apartment with good coffee and the window cracked open and the sounds of the city drifting up while they read separate books in comfortable silence. Long evening walks along the Han River in summer and bundled-up strolls through Buckshin in winter. Conversations that began over dinner and ended somewhere around 2 in the morning, neither of them noticing the time had passed. He was attentive in a way she found disarming. Not performatively, not the kind of attention that announces itself, but genuinely present when he was with her. He remembered small things she had mentioned once and never brought up again. He learned a handful of Yoruba phrases just to surprise her, and his pronunciation was terrible enough to be completely endearing. She, in turn, learned to make doenjang jjigae the way his grandmother had made it, from a recipe she asked his mother for in a moment of genuine effort, and when she finally got it right, the look on Jun-seo's face was one of the things she would remember for a long time, not just pleased, but something deeper, something that looked like he had not expected it. He proposed on the rooftop of a restaurant with a view over the Han River, on an evening in late spring when the sky stayed light until nearly 9 o'clock. She said yes before he had finished the sentence. She cried, which she had not expected to do, and he laughed softly and wiped her face with his thumb, and it was one of those moments that become a fixed point in a person's life. A before and after. They married 6 months later. A small ceremony, elegant and intentional, attended by a carefully selected group of people who actually mattered to them. Amara's older sister flew in from London. Her closest Lagos friends sent voice messages that played during the reception and made the whole room laugh and then quietly well up. Jun-seo's family was formal, composed, impeccably dressed, his mother in particular, Mrs. Lim, a woman of precise manners and watchful eyes who offered Amara a smile that was warm enough on the surface and unreadable underneath. After the wedding, Amara moved into the apartment Jun-seo owned in Mapogu. It was a beautiful place, the kind of apartment that felt deliberate rather than accidental, with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city like a living painting, clean modern lines, and a kitchen that was large enough to actually cook in, which mattered to Amara enormously. She kept her consultancy work, which had grown steadily. Her days were full, purposeful, her own. Her evenings, more often than not, were spent with a man she loved in a home that felt like the beginning of something that would last. For the first year, there was genuinely nothing to question. They had their frictions, quiet disagreements about finances, the occasional tension that comes from 2 private people learning to share a space completely, 1 or 2 arguments that stung a little and then healed. But nothing that felt like damage. Nothing structural. She was happy. She was certain she was happy. She would have told you so without hesitation. The change, when it came, was so gradual that she did not register it as change at first. She registered it as noise. Interference. Small things that confused her and that she attributed, each time, to tiredness or distraction or the general static of a busy life. Her keys. That was the first thing. She had a habit, fixed, automatic, completely unconscious, of dropping her keys on the kitchen counter the moment she walked in the door. Left of the fruit bowl. Every single day, for as long as she had lived in that apartment. She could have found them in the dark. Except one morning they weren't there. She checked the bowl, the hook by the door, her bag twice, her coat pockets. Found them, eventually, on the bathroom shelf, which was not somewhere she had ever put her keys in her life. She chalked it up to distraction. Maybe she had been on the phone when she came in. Maybe she had set them down without thinking. But it happened again. And again. The keys would turn up on the dining table, or inside her shoe, or once, memorably, balanced on top of the bathroom mirror frame in a way she could not have accomplished without deliberately trying. She began to feel a low hum of confusion. A faint, unpleasant sense of not quite trusting herself. Then it was other things. Her phone charger. A pair of earrings she wore weekly. A set of printed client documents she was sure she had left in a particular folder. And then, this one undid her the most, a photograph. It lived on her nightstand, this photo. A picture of herself and her mother at a Christmas gathering 3 years before her mother passed, both of them in matching ochre print, squinting against the sun and laughing at something just out of frame. That photograph had not moved from that nightstand in the 2 years she had lived in that apartment. One morning it was gone. She searched the apartment 3 times. She checked drawers, shelves, underneath furniture. She never found it. She brought it up to Jun-seo that same evening. She was sitting on the bed when she told him, and she noticed the particular quality of his attention as she spoke, very still, very focused, his head tilting slightly as she finished. "You've been so scattered lately," he said, and his voice was careful and soft. "You know how you get when work is heavy. Maybe you moved it yourself and just don't remember." She almost said something sharper. But something in her pulled back. Because was he wrong? She had been busy. She had been tired. She had moved things without thinking before. Maybe she had. She nodded. He patted her hand. She didn't bring it up again. But the confusion had taken root. And alongside the confusion, quietly and without announcement, something else had also taken root. Something watchful. A version of Amara that had decided, without fully forming the decision consciously, to start paying attention. She started keeping a journal. Nothing elaborate, a small notebook she kept in her bag, out of the apartment. She wrote down the dates of the things that disappeared and where they eventually turned up. She wrote down conversations, exact words when she could remember them, the general shape of them when she couldn't. She wrote down the times Jun-seo came home from the office, noting when the explanation he gave and the timeline of the evening didn't quite line up. She felt paranoid doing this. She genuinely did. She told herself it was a way of reassuring herself that she wasn't losing her mind, that if she had records, she could look back and see that the pattern was smaller than it felt. She never got to look back at those records. The notebook disappeared too. That was the moment something in Amara's chest turned cold and still. She stood in her bedroom looking at the inside of her bag, the empty space where the notebook had been, and she felt it. The thing she had been trying not to feel. The thing she had been explaining away for months. This was not her. None of this was her. Something was being done to her. She didn't know the full shape of it yet, didn't understand its dimensions or its destination. But it was being done deliberately, and it was being done by someone who had access to this apartment, and there was only one person who had that kind of access. She put her bag down. She went to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. She stood at the window and looked out at the city and let herself sit with that knowledge for a while without running from it. And then, because she was Amara Osebonsu, because she had grown up in a house where her mother fought for things with grace and her father had told her more times than she could count that her mind was her most unbreakable possession, she started thinking about what came next. She just didn't know yet how deeply she was already in. She didn't know that while she was quietly noticing things and deciding to pay attention, Jun-seo had already been busy. That the campaign had already extended beyond the walls of their apartment. That the people she trusted most were already being shaped, quietly and patiently, into an audience for a story about her that she had never been asked to audition for. She didn't know that the trap was already built. She had only just realized she was inside it. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who love you, genuinely love you, and still cannot see what is happening to you. Not because they don't care, but because the person causing the harm has gotten there first. Has spoken to them already, in quiet corners, in careful phone calls, in the language of concern. Has handed them a version of you that sounds so plausible, so sad, so well-intentioned, that by the time you open your mouth to say something different, you are already behind. That was where Amara found herself as the second year of her marriage deepened into something she no longer had a comfortable word for. Jun-seo had not been idle. While she was writing in her notebook, while she was losing sleep trying to understand the noise in her own life, he had been building something. Not loudly. Never loudly, that was not how he operated. He built it the way you build anything that is meant to last, slowly, with patience, layer by layer, until it was structural. He started with his mother. Mrs. Lim had never been hostile to Amara, exactly. She had been cordial. Measured. The kind of polite that keeps a certain temperature and never varies from it. She had not objected to the marriage, but she had not celebrated it the way a mother celebrates something she is genuinely glad of either. There had always been a quality to her attention, watchful, assessing, that Amara had put down to cultural difference, to a mother's natural wariness about the woman in her son's life, to any number of explanations that were easier than the alternative. Now Jun-seo gave his mother something to do with all of that watchfulness. He began mentioning Amara in their phone calls that happened every Sunday morning while Amara was still sleeping, in the kitchen with the door closed, in that low measured voice he used when he was saying something that needed to land carefully. He told his mother that Amara had been forgetting things. Not dramatically. Not in a way that alarmed. In a way that worried. He said he was concerned, that it seemed to be getting worse, that she had misplaced her keys again and become quite upset about it. He said he didn't want to push her toward a doctor if she wasn't ready. Mrs. Lim, who had never needed much encouragement to decide that her son deserved better, began calling Amara with a new quality of attention. She would ring in the afternoons, which she had never done before, and ask how she was feeling, and the way she asked it, cautious, clinical, like someone reading for symptoms, made Amara's skin prickle. She couldn't articulate why. It just felt off. Like being examined through glass. Then it was Didi. Didi Asanti had been Amara's closest friend in Seoul for 4 years. They had met at a networking event early in Amara's postgraduate year, 2 West African women in a room that did not have many of them, and they had fallen into friendship with the easy inevitability of people who recognize each other. Didi was Ghanaian, funny, sharp, the kind of friend who would tell you exactly what she thought while still somehow making you feel held. Amara trusted her in the way you trust a person who has seen you cry and hasn't made it strange afterward. Jun-seo called Didi. He did not do it once. He did it twice, in those months, and he was careful to frame it as reaching out from a place of not knowing what else to do. He told her Amara hadn't been sleeping. That she had been having episodes of confusion that were becoming more frequent. That there had been a few incidents, he left the word deliberately vague, that had shaken him. He said he didn't want to pressure her but thought maybe Didi, as her closest friend, might gently encourage her to see someone. Didi believed him. Of course she believed him. He was her friend's husband. He had been gentle and specific and clearly distressed. He had no obvious reason to lie. So Didi started calling Amara in a softer voice. Asking how she was feeling with that particular carefulness. Checking in more than she usually did, which Amara noticed and interpreted, at first, as affection. It took her a few weeks to understand that Didi was watching her the way you watch someone you've been told to watch. He did the same thing, in subtler forms, with a colleague of Amara's who occasionally rang the house, and with a couple who were loosely their shared friends, a pair Jun-seo had more access to than Amara did. The message was always the same in its bones, even when the words changed. She's not quite right. I'm worried about her. I'm doing my best. The elegance of the thing, and Amara would later recognize this with a kind of cold awe, the way you recognize skill even when you hate what it has been used for, was that none of it was technically a lie. She had been forgetting things. But he knew why she had been forgetting things. She hadn't been sleeping. But he knew the anxiety driving the sleeplessness. She wasn't quite herself. But he was the reason she wasn't herself, and he used that reason as the evidence for the story he was telling, which meant the story and the cause were the same thing, perfectly circular, perfectly sealed. The people around Amara weren't lying to her. They were being used. And that distinction mattered, though it did not make the loneliness any smaller. Because Amara was now living in a world where the people closest to her had been quietly rearranged. Where she could feel, in small moments, the shift in how she was being seen. The slight alteration in tone. The particular patience in people's voices. She would say something clear, something accurate, something she knew to be true, and she would watch the person in front of her receive it with a kind of careful neutrality, like someone who has already been told not to take everything she says at face value. It was the most isolating feeling she had ever known. More isolating, in some ways, than genuine loneliness, because genuine loneliness at least does not pretend. This was loneliness dressed up as concern. She was surrounded by people who cared about her and were actively making her feel more alone. Jun-seo, meanwhile, became more attentive at home. That was the part that was hardest to carry. He would ask how her day had been with a focus that felt, increasingly, like surveillance. He would suggest, very gently, very regularly, that she speak to a professional. A therapist, a doctor, anyone, because he just wanted her to be well, he said, and she knew that, didn't she? That all of this came from love? She would nod. She would thank him. She would watch his face while he said it and try to find something there, some small tell, some fracture in the performance. And she would find almost nothing. Almost. But there was an evening that cracked something open in her, even though she did not know it at the time. She had come home from work to find him on the balcony, phone pressed to his ear, his body language the loose and easy posture of a man deeply comfortable in a conversation. She could not hear the words through the glass. But she watched him, the way his shoulders moved when he laughed, the way he shifted his weight from foot to foot like he did when something genuinely pleased him, and something in her chest went absolutely quiet. She set her bag down. She went to the kitchen and began unloading groceries. By the time she turned around, he was inside, phone gone, asking about her day with exactly the right amount of warmth. She asked who had called. A colleague, he said. Something to do with the third quarter report. She nodded. She finished the groceries. She said nothing more. But later that night, lying in the dark listening to his slow even breathing, she turned the scene over carefully in her mind. The way his shoulders had moved when he laughed. The posture of a man not discussing a third quarter report. The speed with which he wrapped the call once he realized she was home. She filed it. She didn't know yet what to do with it, but she filed it in the part of herself that was still paying attention, that had been quietly, stubbornly paying attention this whole time, even while everything around her conspired to convince her that her own attention could not be trusted. The next morning, while Jun-seo showered, she looked at the balcony where he had been standing. She didn't touch his phone. She didn't go through anything. She simply stood there and breathed, and made herself a promise for the second time, that she was not losing her mind, that she knew herself, and that whatever she was living inside was not going to define how this ended. She just needed a thread. One thread, and she would follow it wherever it led. She found it 9 days later. She had taken one of his older blazers to the dry cleaners, a task she had been doing routinely for years, a domestic habit she had never thought twice about. She was about to hand it over at the counter when she felt a slight stiffness in the inside breast pocket. She reached in. Pulled out a small, folded receipt. A restaurant receipt. Japanese cuisine. Itaewon. The amount on it was for 2 people, 2 sets of drinks, 2 starters, 2 mains, and the date was a Tuesday evening, 6 weeks earlier, when Jun-seo had told her he was having dinner with 3 colleagues and his director. A working dinner. He had come home smelling faintly of sake and apologizing for the late hour. She stood at the dry cleaner counter with the receipt in her hand and a woman behind her in line who was beginning to clear her throat impatiently. She handed over the blazer. She put the receipt in her coat pocket. She walked out onto the street and stood in the autumn air and breathed. She did not panic. She noted that she did not panic, that what she felt instead was a particular cold clarity, the sensation of a question you have been circling finally asking itself plainly. The dinner could mean anything. She told herself this on the walk home. It could be nothing. 2 colleagues. An old friend. A client. A dinner for 2 meant nothing on its own. But she went home and she sat at the kitchen table, and without the notebook, it was still missing. She began reconstructing from memory the timeline she had been quietly building in her head. The evenings that didn't add up. The calls that ended too quickly. The particular easy posture on the balcony. The receipt. She laid it all out in her mind, and she looked at it clearly, and she understood that the question was no longer whether something was happening. The question was what, exactly, and how much of it, and who. She did not yet have the answers. But she now had the receipt. And she still had her memory, which Jun-seo had been working very hard to make her doubt, which meant her memory was probably the most dangerous thing in that apartment. She folded the receipt carefully and pressed it between the pages of a book on her bedside table. And then she did the thing that would change everything. She called Chisholm. Chisholm was someone she had known since graduate school, a woman who now worked in tech in a capacity that Amara had never asked too many questions about, mainly because Chisholm made it clear that the questions would not be answered in any satisfying way. She was brilliant, private, and absolutely loyal to people she considered hers. Amara was one of those people. She told Chisholm she needed help. She said she thought her husband was hiding something, that she couldn't prove it yet, but she had a receipt and a pattern and a feeling she had been living with for months. She asked if there was anything she could do, legally, without touching anything she shouldn't touch, to find out more. Chisholm was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Is there a shared device? Something old, something he might not be protecting as carefully anymore?" There was a tablet. In the living room. Jun-seo had used it frequently the first year of their marriage, and then less often, and now almost never. It was still connected to the household Wi-Fi. It still sat in its charging dock on the shelf between the television and the bookcase. Chisholm walked her through it. What to look for. How to access deleted data. Which apps retained sync logs even after content was cleared. Amara listened carefully. She wrote nothing down this time. She kept it all in her head. She waited until Jun-seo had a full day of meetings across town. She sat down with the tablet, and she took her time, and she followed every step Chisholm had given her. And that was when the floor dropped out from under everything. The messages went back almost 14 months. Her name was Soyeon. She was 26 years old, worked in marketing, and she was, based on the photographs Jun-seo had sent and received in those threads, the kind of beautiful that photographers describe as effortless, light-boned, doe-eyed, with a smile that looked like it required no effort at all. The messages between them were not new. They were not the careful, surface-level messages of something that had just begun. They were settled. Interior. Full of the shorthand and the small recurring references that only develop between 2 people who have spent real time together. There were mentions of specific restaurants. Of a weekend trip. Of inside jokes Amara could not decode. There were photographs, nothing that crossed a line, but intimate in the softer sense, the sense of someone who has become comfortable. There were, in recent months, conversations about the future that made Amara's hands go still on the screen. He had been looking at apartments. 2 bedrooms. Her area of the city. He had asked Soyeon about her schedule in March, whether she could be free to meet with an agent. And then there was the message. The one that rewrote everything. Sent 4 months ago. Jun-seo to Soyeon. 6 words that Amara read slowly, then a second time, then a third. Be patient. I'm handling it. She won't be a problem for much longer. She won't be a problem for much longer. Amara set the tablet down on the coffee table. She sat very still in the living room of the apartment she had believed was her home, in the marriage she had believed was her life, and she sat with those 6 words for a long time. And then she did something Jun-seo had not calculated, had never once considered, because he had spent the last year convinced that the woman he was living with was becoming too confused and too doubted and too isolated to do anything that required precision. She picked up her phone. She opened the camera. And she photographed every single message on that screen. All of them. Methodically. Every thread. Every photograph. Every apartment listing. Every word. She was completely calm while she did it. She noted that. Filed it. Because the calm felt important, not fragile, not performed, but real, the way the calm of a woman who has made a decision is real. She uploaded everything to a cloud account she created on the spot, under an email address that had never existed before that afternoon. She logged out. She returned the tablet to its charging dock, exactly as she had found it. She put her phone in her pocket. And then she sat in that living room for a while longer, in the quiet, looking at the apartment around her, the beautiful clean lines, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city spread out beyond them like it always had been, and she understood that everything she was looking at was already over. She just had to be the one to decide how. She thought about Soyeon, who did not know her, who had been promised a version of this life that required Amara to disappear from it. She thought about his mother, watchful and waiting. She thought about Didi, her friend, who had been handed a story about her and had believed it because she had no reason not to. She thought about the message. She won't be a problem for much longer. She had one question now. One question that sat in her chest like a stone she needed to move before she could take a full breath. What, exactly, did Jun-seo Lim mean by that? And how far was he willing to go? Because there was handling a situation, and there was something else. Something colder. And until she understood which one she was dealing with, she was going to have to be very, very careful about what she did next. The door opened. His key in the lock. Footsteps in the entryway. She looked at her hands in her lap. She smoothed her expression. And by the time he appeared in the living room doorway, she was looking up at him with the face of a woman who had had a quiet day at home, and she smiled, and she said, "How were the meetings?" in a voice that gave away absolutely nothing. Because the most dangerous thing Amara Osebonsu had in her possession right now was not the photographs on that cloud account. It was that he had no idea she had taken them. She found the messages. She knows what he said. But what did he mean by, "She won't be a problem for much longer"? And what is she about to do about it? Part 2 drops soon. Hit the like button, make sure you're subscribed and have your notifications on, because this is the part that changes everything.